This is the Horse Radio Network.
This is episode 12 of Equestrian Legends. Hello, I'm Chris Stafford, and my guest this week is American event rider Michael Page. Michael Owen Page was born on September 23, 1938, in New York City. The first of 4 children, Michael set himself an early standard of horsemanship by winning the American Horse Shows Association's medal finals in 1956, and was encouraged by his father to pursue his equestrian career in Europe. He trained in the world-renowned French cavalry school of Saumur from 1957 to 58, and upon returning to America was recognized for his potential as a U.S. team member. His international career included 3 Olympic Games and 3 Pan American Games. At the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, he placed 4th individually and earned team silver riding Grasshopper. And at the 1968 Mexico Olympics on Foster, he won individual bronze and team silver. His Pan American Games record is flawless, with 2 individual gold medals, first in the 1959 Chicago and then in the 1963 Sao Paulo Games, where he was also a member of the gold medal team. In the 1967 Winnipeg Games, he returned to win another team gold medal. Grasshopper was inducted into the U.S. Eventing Association's Eventing Hall of Fame in 1999. Upon retiring as a competitor, Michael coached the Canadian 3-day event team at the 1976 Olympics and served as chef d'équipe at the 1988 Olympic Games in Seoul, the 1990 World Championships, and 1992 Olympic Games in Barcelona. Michael was inducted into the U.S. Eventing Hall of Fame in 2006. He continues to be a popular clinician and spends 7 days a week teaching new generations of hunter-jumper riders as well as judging. Michael has served as chair of many committees, including the AHSA Equitation Committee, Nominating Committee, and USET Nominating Committee. In addition, he judged the AHSA ASPCA National Equitation Finals 7 times and the Intercollegiate National Finals 4 times. He and his wife, Georgette, live in New York. They have 1 son, Matthew. Well, Michael, it seems that even in your advancing years, life is not slowing down for you. You have the enthusiasm that you always had.
Right. Well, training event horses was the beginning of my career. And, currently, what I'm doing is, after Mexico in 1968, I had the 2 medals there. And as I was on the airplane going home, I knew I was going back to the office to work. I said that was going to be the last event I rode in. And I was going to continue my riding by doing jumpers. And that's what I've done ever since 1968. I've been, riding, training, jumpers, equitation horses, little hunters, but basically, jumpers.
So not so much of the eventing these days, though. Your success was always with the eventers, but what made you make the switch then, Michael?
Well, I was, I always had a part-time job working, in the city with my father, and, I was in sales, so I was able to, work a schedule that allowed me, after I did my 4 years in Europe, to, do the team, do the Olympics, do the training for that, just by leaving the office. But I always came back to the office after, I was done with that. And then I knew that in 1968, which was my 3rd Games, right, that, it was just not part of the cards to full-time be an event rider, an event trainer, and my interest hadn't been necessarily to be an event rider. It was what my education and experience led me to, but it didn't make any real difference to me whether I used that knowledge and experience to do flat work with horses that were going to be jumpers or continue to do that, and that's what we did as a training program for the horses I rode. So eventing was sort of a chapter in my life, and it ended in '68, which was a lot of years ago. But it didn't minimize the amount of time I invested in it. It just was, the horses still had four legs. They, instead of galloping cross country, they went more in the ring, and it was more structured to my lifestyle at that, for the last 50 years, I guess, right? 40 years anyhow.
Well, you are and always have been, Michael, a city boy. So let's go back to those early days growing up and give us a sense of your very early childhood, your earliest memories, Michael.
It is pretty clear, because the step-by-step process really, when I look back, I was extraordinarily lucky. When I was 15 years old, it's really simple. My father and I were sitting in the living room, and he said, Michael, if you're as passionate as you appear to be about riding, probably you should, think about how you could develop your riding skills with the limited amount of resources that we have. And my suggestion, instead of going to, this is when I was 15, he said, my suggestion was, you have a periodical, a monthly magazine called The Light Horse. Said you look in the magazine and you write to 4 or 5 places and see if there's some place we could send you instead of going to camp for the summer. I think, my father said, that you could get a better education, learn more about a passion you have by going and spending a summer in England where you speak the language than you could by us sending you to camp. So I wrote, and I got 3 prospectuses back, and one was from Captain Eddie Goldman in Cheshire. And so my father suggested that I go to England for the summer and learn more about what I had a passion to learn more about, which was to ride better. And so I went to Eddie Goldman for the summer, and I spent a summer, I wouldn't say crying, but learning to put a horse on the bit. And at the same time, he had Sheila Wilcox there with a horse called High and Mighty. And Sheila, as you know, won 3 badmintons. And when I came back to this country at the end of the summer and starting to develop a little bit of knowledge about, how to ride a horse in a frame and on the bit, and which was really an interesting dynamic, because a friend in the barn, Saddle Tree Farms, and there where I was riding, a gentleman had a old cavalry horse where it did local jumper shows and had a big brand down its neck, and he said to my father that he would pay half the expenses, and he thought that it would be he would enjoy having a young man ride his horse and go to the horse shows and do the equitation and et cetera, et cetera. And so I did that for the year and a half after that, and I went to the Madison Square Garden, and I braided the horse. The horse had a big brand down its neck, and the medal finals. I actually won the medal finals in Madison Square Garden on this, old cavalry horse, and his name was Candlestick. And I would say about 9 years later, after having been on the Olympic teams, Ginny Moss and Hope Scott. Ginny was one of the judges, Mrs. Moss from Southern Pines. And I used to, on the way to Florida in the winter, in show jumping, I used to stop in Southern Pines and bring some Olympic mementos to Ray Firestone, who had purchased plain sailing that Mike Plum rode, and Mrs. Moss, who had been instrumental in giving me the first opportunity to do something a little bit special. And I went to Mrs. Moss, and I said, Mrs. Moss, I'd like to ask you a question. I said, I won the medal finals that you and Mrs. Scott judged. And, I had a horse that I braided, had a big brand on its neck. And how did you pick me to win the medal finals in Madison Square Garden. And she looked me straight in the eye, and I'll never forget this. She said, "Michael, you were the only rider that had educated hands." Mm-hmm. So what the stepping stones of my father saying you needed to learn more about riding, and Eddie Goldman and Sheila Wilcox in Cheshire giving me those first experiences of, having a horse on the bit and riding from your leg to your hand was a chapter that was written that, only if that had happened would it have ever happened that I won the medal finals. And that was a big step in my next chapter, going back to Europe for the 4 years of high school and being able to walk into the Fédération Française de Sports Équestres, and General Boucaud said to me, "Who are you?" And he said, "You have to get a recommendation reference from your national federation." Since I just won the medal finals, they knew who I was, and 2 days later they got back and he said, "Well, you're lucky, young man, because this year, for the first time, the civilians are going to be allowed to ride at the French Cavalry School at Saumur." And so that was the next chapter of my career.
Well, two obviously wonderful opportunities, not least of all, as you said, with Eddie Goldman, who himself was a legend in his own lifetime.
You've heard of Eddie then?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Right. So I spent my first summer there with my father saying, he didn't know nothing about riding. He said, "Michael, since we don't have, a lot of resources, we have to be creative about finding ways to give you an education that is going to broaden your knowledge." And what was extraordinary was that Mrs. Moss, Jenny Moss, who was a hunting, person legend from Southern Pines, recognized something different that I did that allowed her and Mrs. Scott to let me win the medal finals, which was an important piece of the next step of, the first year that civilians were allowed to go to Saumur, and that was an extraordinary 2 years. I remember saying to myself, I can't believe it. All I have to do is spit on my shoes to my boots, live long enough getting through the tap queue that they start 3 months, 6 horses a day, no stirrups. What they did for the officers' courses that were going to be, become, second lieutenants in the French cavalry. And this was the first year that civilians were allowed. And so that I started there. And what happened one day, the Equestrian chef, Colonel Margot, who was, an iconic dressage figure and the head of the Garde Noir at Saumur. I remember him saying to me, I was in the what they had there was they had the Corps de Perfectionnement Équestre, which was for the officers, and the Soumettre de Manège, which is for the non-commissioned officers. And everyone was only allowed to go in the non-commissioned officers course. And I had a room in the non-commissioned officers barracks, but since I was a civilian, I was a member of the officers' mess and NCO mess. And one day we were, in the NCO, the course, we did 6 horses a day, an hour and 15 minutes, no stirrups to begin with. And you literally, you did no stirrups, so you had to jump on from the ground, they turn, they go away, hour and 15 minutes, you come back. You did that. Another horse would all be lined up. There'd be 12 of us were in the non-commissioned officers course. Horses would all be lined up. There were 300 horses at the stables, which was, minuscule compared to the 3,000 that were there when they actually fought on a when they had real cavalry. So we wore layers off the, beneath our breeches, and it used to be that we would spend, or I would spend 45 minutes sort of so sore, sitting on the saddle, that you had to get the blood had to become, warm from the time that you spent in the saddle before it stopped hurting, and you just didn't eat lunch. You just sort of stood against the wall, and you jumped back on, and off you went again. And then one day, I was walking across the carrière, and Margot looked up. He was riding, and he said, "Page, venez ici. À partir de demain, vous montez avec le CPE," which was my transition from the NCO course to the officers course, of which Jack LeGoff was in charge. And it meant that the French government paid for all my competing, and I rode French Army horses. And Jack LeGoff, who is probably the finest horseman I've ever met, and who I got to know very well, and he rode in the Rome Olympics, and became the legendary coach of the American team. And to jump ahead a little bit, when we were in Mexico together, Jack had Guillaume, who was also at Summer, and won the individual medal, and he said to me, "Michael, I'd like to talk to you, when the event is over." And I said, "Jack, sure, that's great." And then we went, and then he asked Georgette to come with me, who's now my wife. She was grooming for me in Foster. And we went up to the French little chalet. And he said, "The political situation in France is really, very difficult for me. I don't think that there's going to be the possibility of me finding a spot in France that would be something I would be interested in." I don't know exactly how he put it, but, we were chatting away in French. And I said, "Holy Jesus, Jack, I have a great idea. Major Lynch, who's the American coach, is finished with the American team, because they're starting a Morven Park in the United States, and he's going to be the headmaster there." I said, "When I get back to the States, since we don't have a coach in the United States, I'm going to go call Mr. Stone, who's the president of the USET, and go down to his office and suggest that he think about hiring you for the next coach for the United States team." And he said, "Michael, that would really be great. If it happens, happens. If it doesn't happen, it's still a great idea." When I got back to the States, I called Mr. Stone's office, and I'd been there once before when I'd come back from badminton. I'd come back with a mustache, and I'd gotten a call from Mr. Stone's office saying that wanted to see me. And I went, "Holy shit, what do they want to see me about?" And I walked into Mr. Stone's office, and he said, "Michael, sit down." He said, "Do you like riding on the team?" And I said, "Yes, sir." Right? He said, "Well, that stuff that's underneath your nose and above your lips is not representative of the United States team." I said, "Yes, sir." So I went back and obviously shaved it off. So I'd been there once before, Stone and Webster. And so I sat down, and Mr. Stone, I said, "I'd like to talk to you a minute about what I hope and think would be the greatest acquisition the American team could have for the future, since I'm no longer going to be an event rider and, doing other things." And I explained to him my relationship to Jack LeGoff, what Jack LeGoff had been, how he had trained the Olympic gold medalist in Mexico, had he been ridden on the team, how I thought he was probably one of the greatest horsemen, or probably the greatest horseman I'd ever met. And he said, "Michael," he said, just as it happens, I have a mare called Chuvy, who is running in the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe in Paris in 2 weeks." And he said, "When I go to France, I will look up Jack LeGoff, and I will let you know sort of what happened." And about a month later, I got a call from Mr. Stone's office saying that they had tentatively hired Jack LeGoff to be the next coach of the team. when I walked away from the team, I walked away feeling that, I was personally happy with the success I had, but that I was also helping set up the next years of what the team ultimately became, which was, juggernaut, the best team in the world. So that was sort of like all the pieces sort of fit together.
Well, I want to talk a lot more about the team and your involvement there. But before we do that, I want to go back a little bit, if we may,
Sure.
to your very earliest days, Michael. You mentioned that when you were in your mid-teens, your father gave you the encouragement to make your way with horses. But what was life when you were a very small child? You were the first of 4 children. Tell us a little bit, give us a picture, if you will, of the very early days growing up in New York City and indeed your school days. Were you a good scholar? Were you an enthusiastic scholar?
I wasn't a good scholar, and we moved to Pelham, which is lower Westchester County, and and the only thing I really remember is when I was 10 years old. Somehow the bug or the passion for riding started, and there was about a quarter of a mile down in actually the Bronx. We were right on the edge of the Bronx. There was a riding academy called Split Rock Riding Academy, and I used to ride my bicycle down, and I started taking lessons once a week. But I also remember, haunting the stables, and the horses were all in straight stalls, and I remember climbing on one horse and going from horse to horse to horse to horse down the line, going from one horse to the other. And when I was about, I would say 13, I always had a passion. I was the only boy that rode in middle school. I was the only boy that rode in high school. I remember when we moved up to, from Pelham to, then we moved to Briarcliff, which is in the middle of the county, and then Georgette and I moved to Bedford, and then we moved to North Salem. So I probably lived 35 miles in my whole life, from the time I was a child. But always, I had a passion for riding, and I remember my sister started, and at Split Rock, there was one day she was always talented. She was a cheerleader. She was smart. She went to Cornell. I, went to Europe when I graduated from high school, and I remember taking trigonometry, and I failed it, because I can't keep track of numbers and the sequential type of thing.
Where did you go to school?
I went to Illinois public, middle school, and then Pelham High School. And before we moved to Briarcliff, half of my senior year, and I disliked Pelham High School. It was very big, and I didn't have many friends because I used to go ride. And when we moved up to Briarcliff, all of a sudden I had 3 friends. We were the 3 Musketeers, and I had a great last half year of my high school experience. So I was never really very good at school. I used to read, but I wasn't very good at math. I don't know whether it was just because I was absorbed with something else, but just keeping track, much just like I am now. I've never touched a computer. The only cell phone that I have is in my car. I talk to people on the phone if they want to speak to me or I want to know something. My wife has an iPad. I can ask her, what stocks did today or something. But, I think I'm just about as absorbed with what I enjoy doing and still try to do it as well as I can do it as I was when I first started. It's different, obviously. You have to make a living. And, but also because of the great experiences I've had and the great diversity of the education I've had, I feel that, giving back to the young riders who feel that it's impossible to sort of go where they want to go. It's never impossible to do it. You have to not just dream it. You have to, intelligently create the opportunities that are going to allow you to step by step. And even if you don't get there, if you fulfill, your passion, to become the best you can become, that's probably more important than anything else. I think all the great riders, yes, you want to win the, gold medal in the Olympics, but more than that, you want to ride horses that think you're really cool and that they go for you because you ride better than almost anyone else that can ride them. And I think that's the most fulfilling aspect you can be as a horseman. And all the horsemen I know, I think, and I used to think, that, I'm not a very competitive person. It's just that there are unique horses that you challenge you to use your experience and your passion, to fulfill who they are. And if you can do that, they ultimately carry you to those places. I mean, like Grasshopper or Foster. I mean, they were special, unique, different. The last 4 jumpers that have been donated to Ken. I mean, it's like, it's just as fulfilling and interesting now as it was. I mean, you don't get the suitcases full of stuff at the Olympics. You don't get the medals. You don't get the glory necessarily. But if you've had that, you don't really need it anymore. What you need is if that is who you are, you need the fulfillment of doing what you passionately love to do and feel that you're, not so diminished in where you are now. I remember, I think after the 68 Olympics or sometime after that when I was show jumping, I remember Billy Steingraus saying to me, he said, Michael, if you could really only learn the technical aspects of riding, you would really be very good. And I said, Billy, you're absolutely right. I am limited in the technical aspects of riding, but I hope that the horses compensate for the technical aspects that I don't have by becoming who they can become more, because the technical aspects, to a certain extent, limit the fulfillment of the horse's abilities, right? And it's like going back to watching Margot at Saumur, who was the Equestrian chef, and would kick everybody out of the indoor rings when he went, and he was dressage, right? And there I rode as the last member every once in a while on the Reprise des Equiers, which is a great thing, in dressage. And but Margot was I think what I am just saying. He was so much a master, but he was a master within who he was and what he created in the horse, which made all the other winning riders respect who he was. And that was something special.
Well, you mentioned that you were not an enthusiastic scholar, but in fact your father and his brothers were in Ivy League colleges, very well educated.
Right.
I want to talk a little bit, if we can, Michael, about your parents and the values that they bestowed upon you. Let's hear about your father. I believe he was a big influence in your life.
My father was very probably. I mean, I still. One of the things, and I do clinics, when I talk about, when I went off to Europe, and this is, true, and it affects me to this day. If you talk to me, he had wanted to be a Shakespearean actor and had gone to, Austria and Russia, and, in those times when, that wasn't easy to travel, and in studying, the theater. And I remember, and he did it for, 5 or 6 years. And I remember when I was going off after I'd won the medal finals, he said, Michael, I have a couple of pieces of advice for you. He said, I think you're fulfilling your passion. And he said, 2 things I want you to remember. He said, whenever you're in the washroom, and you know what, we always wore watches with leather bands, he said, always remember to put your watch in your pocket, right? He said, you never leave it. And I remember when I got off the train in Neuchâtel, the 2nd of January, and I had no place to go. It was snowing. I had my suitcase and my saddle, and I went to the youth hostel, and it was just when the refugees were all coming in from, one of the countries there that were having problems. And, he said, the second thing is, he said, you put your watch in your pocket, right? And the second thing is, anytime you have to go to the bathroom, right? You never delay thinking that, you can always go later, when you're traveling, when you're in the world. He said, and those 2 pieces of advice I remember to this day. And when I do clinics, I talk about, people who are going to go off and do different things. And it's amazing how different the advice is, but how it impacts every single day of your life, and you're better off with the advice that you get. And if you listen to the advice, you're happier, you're healthier, and, life is just easier to deal with. And we used to talk about religion, on the subway going up to Grand Central Station. And we used to be hanging on to things, and he didn't believe in God. He thought that people, needed to create a God in order to answer the questions they had about, what happens after you die, what happens, things, it was, he thought religion was great for everybody that needed it, probably made them better, right? But, right or wrong is also something that's, easy to understand if you have the knowledge and the experience and the ability to think. So those were a couple of the things that impacted me. And, I think when he came back from Europe and he went to work and we made hat lines, it was a 4th generation hat lines, went to the dyeing industry. And I think what happened, he met my mother, worked in the factory. And I think what happened is, no one has ever said this to me, but I think I came along. And when you have a child, the world changes. And I think he accepted that. And my mother was a great mother, and she lived for her family. And, but the experiences and the knowledge that I think he gained by all the traveling he did and all the experiences of being in Europe and having to think for himself, and he passed that all on to me, so I never had to go through any of the difficulties, right? And I'm not sure that he had any difficulties. I think it was just how life makes changes, where all the steps that I took, happened to work out. Being in Paris and, summer accepting students and civilians for the first time, and going to Fontainebleau, the French national championships, on a French horse, and being 6th or 7th in the military section, and my friend Herbie keeping the news of all the events I competed with Le Goff and Durand in France, and getting a telegram from, when I was finishing up my 4 years after the championships in Fontainebleau, getting a telegram from the team saying, John Galvin had purchased 6 event horses for his daughter, Trish, who then decided she wanted to be a dressage rider. And so he was making Rancho San Fernando Rey available to the team. He would sponsor the team, pay for the horses to go back to the Pan American Games. And so I told my father, and I said, do I have the shot? And he said, sounds, like it's your dream come true. So from there, I went out to California. I got Grasshopper. I'm small. Grasshopper was small. I could ride a little bit in those days. And he was, as tough as nails and tougher than nails. And, the fastest event horse in the world at that time, not because he was that fast, but just because he went that fast after 22 miles, that it was unique and special. So, when I came back from France, I felt that I could sit on a horse if they stood up, and I probably could, if you did as much riding and, jumping, competing as one did. And at summer on Saturdays before they let us go, we had to do the sauteur au pilier, which is where they do the croupade and the cabriole, in the pillars. And they would launch you, before they would let you. So you went, you probably went 6-8 feet in the air, not because you couldn't sit on a horse, but because, the maître, the equier would all be laughing, saying how many times it took to, and then, there was no hot water in the where the rooms where I stayed during the winter. So I only took a bath on Sundays. I only changed the sheets once a month. So, you can imagine riding in an indoor manege, right? But every day I used to get up and say, God, I can't believe how good this is. Don't have to think. See, and obviously I was thinking I wasn't in college, not having to do math, right? So, it was an interesting experience.
Well, I'm curious that your father was obviously very understanding about you wanting to spend your life with horses and take it very seriously, because, he had obviously a very different choices in life, wanting to be a Shakespearean actor and going into a family business.
Right.
Was there any other equestrian influence in your family, his family,
None.
Your mother's family, your siblings?
None.
Were you the lone soldier
None.
here?
Lone. And my father knew nothing about horses and riding. I remember when I came back from Eddie Goldman's, and I was riding Herbie's, the cavalry horse, and I was practicing my equitation. My father used to every once in a while come up watch me ride, and he said, it doesn't look like you're making very good circles. You should do another 10, right? Because, even I can see that the circles don't look like circles, right? I mean, that was the extent of his, we had a one-horse wooden trailer that my father paid half for, that we used to take, go to the horse shows. He used to pay half, and Herbie paid half. And it was like, it couldn't be done nowadays, I don't think. On the other hand, you never can say never. One of the things I talk about when I do my clinics, when I used to judge my 30 or 40 horse shows a year, in the beginning when I was, the chairman of the equitation committee and, this and the USET board and stuff, I used to go to South Florida. And 2 years I used to judge horse shows down there, right? And there was one little horse show I used to go to. And that was the time when, it must have been about 25, 30 years ago. There was, they used to bring all these, in those days, the cold-blooded horses that they brought from Germany really did not have the blood they have now. And, we used to call them Dunbloods, right? And the ladies used to go over there and buy, the German boys used to ride, and they used to be perfectly schooled, perfectly dressaged, horses that could jump a little bit, and they used to bring them back to Florida, and they used to do a little bit, and all of a sudden the horses would look around and say, this is ridiculous, and this little person that's riding me can't ride forward, so I'm not going to go forward anymore. And, they hit him with a stick, and all of a sudden they'd be rearing. And I used to go to this little horse show, and I promise you it's absolutely the truth. First year I get there, I see this 15, 16-year-old girl, and there'd be a horse standing up at the inn gate, right? And someone would walk up with a lunge whip and go whack, and the horse would bolt into the ring. And I'd write on my judge's card, I still remember doing it, eliminated, right? because it wouldn't even jump a jump. It would just bolt out the outgate, right? And 4 or 5 horses later, there'd be something coming in, right? And this little girl would, I'd say, holy Jesus, I hope she lives long enough to, grow up. And I came back the next year, and there was horses doing exactly the same thing, and she'd be there, and some of them would go around, but they're all different horses, and I think she was probably 17 the second year, right? And about I would say 20 years later, I'm at the National Horse Show in New York, and there's a girl riding on the United States team, and I go up to Margie, and I say, Margie, I use you as an inspiration. I remember in South Florida when you used to be those horses rearing at the in-gate, and someone would use a lunge whip and they'd bolt in, and I'd write eliminated on the card. And she laughed and said, oh, I remember that, Michael. And I said, do you realize how, even in this day, which is a lot, many years later than when I did it, that there's still an opportunity for someone who doesn't have a horse to, to be, to go all the way to being on the team. She said, I remember that, right? And she said, what happened was that there was a gentleman, I forgot what she said his name was, that had this gray stallion called Daydream. And she said, he saw me riding, he saw me suffering, he saw me doing, going through, and he said, Margie, right, I have a horse, stallion that I have seen you ride. I know how aggressive you are. I know how you've had to become aggressive. I want you to start riding this horse for me. And as she said, the rest, as they say, was history. And that night, she had a mare at that time called Laurel. I don't know whether you remember Laurel or not, but Laurel was, I think, the one mare that went in a snaffle bridle. That was probably the best horse. Maybe she's had a lot of better ones since, but Laurel was special. And she won the Grand Prix in New York. There were 4 cleans. She was the last to go in the jump off. There was a 3-stride line, a 3-stride bending line, at 5'3", and she popped over the first one. Everybody had a rail down, either the first or the second. She did 4 strides, jumped clean, and won the Grand Prix in New York. And it was just for me, an amazing story to see in almost this day and age, someone who literally came from nowhere to be one of the most successful and greatest Grand Prix riders in the United States. And it was something that I enjoy talking about when I'm doing a clinic. And, and to be there that night and talk to Margie and have her laugh about where she came from and how it gave her the opportunity to go where she went was just, I think, inspiring for anyone who thinks that it cannot be done, because she certainly has done it.
Right. Well, I want to just go back to join up your earlier days to your progression onto the team, Michael. But before we do, there is an interesting story about how you met your wife, Georgette, because it was you were both very young then, or she was particularly young.
She was particularly young. I was 27, because I know we still have 10 years difference between us, right? So even I still can figure that out, right? It's one of the few things I can figure out. Do I know the day? What? And the only way I can figure out the day, I know she was 17. It was Christmas time, and I got, as it was again, after Tokyo, I retired. I retired for 2 years, judged, did a lot of, judging and did different things, clinics, and worked in the city. And, and I got a call from the team, Gladstone. And they said, Michael, we have some horses. And I had been chairman of the selection committee for the eventing, and, so I'd been really involved with the eventers. And they said, we have a couple of horses, Gallopade, and would you be perhaps interested in coming back and trying one of the horses? And I said, I spoke to my father, and he said, it's only a 3-hour on the train, right, from, Gladstone to the city. we were at 19 West 4th Street. My grandfather owned the building right off Washington Square. And he said, see how it is. So I went out to Gladstone. It was probably the 21st of, December, 2 years after, Tokyo. So Tokyo was 60, 64, so 65, 66. So I can pretty much pinpoint it as 66, right? And I walked in, and the event horses are all on the ground floor, and the jumpers were all on the upper floor. But there's a ramp that goes up between the two. You've been to Gladstone, haven't you?
Yes, indeed.
Yes, right. And there's a ramp that goes up and down, from the two floors, right? Because that's where Foster used to go up to look at Snowbound, when we turned him loose, right? So I walked into the barn. We came down the stairs, and there was a girl sitting on the tack trunk right at the corner, right where, I don't know, either Gallopade or Foster was in the stall. And, I had saw Stefan von Vichy, and he said, go see. I thought he had said George, but it was Georgette. So I walked down, and I said, I'm supposed to see George. So she glared at me, right, because her name was Georgette, right? I mean, she was cute, right? But she certainly didn't think much of me for calling her the wrong name, right? And I said, I'm supposed to get on, ride the horse. So I think I rode 2 horses, and I said, which horse do you take care of? And she said, I'm not happily, right? She said, I had Foster, right? And he's had some problems with Plum. I went to Burley, the World Championships, and I had remember, since I was either selector or chairman of the selection committee, Meg Plum owned the horse, and Meg was a little bit weak. And I don't mean weak in a bad way, but the horse always had, he always knew he could take advantage of her. So she'd go to pull, and he'd pull harder. And since he was a naturally talented jumper, he really was pretty special. Everybody thought he was special when Meg was riding him, because he took over from Meg and sort of did the job. And then when he was given to the team, because he was really sort of a special talent and looked like he had a special brain, because he was always, sort of taking over from her, they gave him to Mike, who was the leading rider. Again, he was the special horse. And they went to Burley, and I think he stopped at the 5th fence at the water. And so he came home, and they did a few schooling sessions with him, and they sort of broke his spirit a little bit, or a lot. And Georgette made sure that he went and was turned out. And then when he came back, I said, which horse do you take care of? And she said, Foster. I said, oh, I remember Foster. I remember when Meg rode him, right? And he was really special. They said, well, everyone thought he was special, but Mike rode him. And it's not Mike's kind of a horse. Mike dominates a horse. And Mike rode 8 Olympic Games, and everybody has a little bit different style. But if your style doesn't match the positive aspects of the horse, it might not work. And with Mike and Foster, it didn't work. I mean, it's worked with a lot of other horses, but with Foster, it didn't work. So I said, geez, I think this would be I had seen him as a really good horse, as everybody else had seen him when Meg rode him. He didn't suit Mike, and the schooling was not pretty, and it really bothered the horse a lot. But since the girl was really cute, and I knew the horse might be really good, I thought that would be a really cool horse to take on as a not because I thought he wasn't going to get to be good, but because I thought he might be able to be good. And so I lived at Gladstone, and I commuted 3 hours to the city, and then I came back 3 hours every night and lived upstairs, and I started dating Georgette, who did the horse. And when we used to come back, which probably no one knows, the jumpers were upstairs, San Lucas and Snowbound and, all the great horses, and, George. and Billy and everybody, and no one used to be around at night, and the horse used to tremble in the corner, and we used to figure out that this was Georgette figuring out that he needed not to be afraid to walk out of the stall. So we used to go down, when I got back, we used to go up to the Chester Diner, have dinner, then drive back, and it used to be dark. We'd put lights on, night check, and I'm sure it was my wife who figured out. She said, he doesn't, he cowers in the corner. We got to get him to come out. And I said, the best thing, what we could do, why don't we open his stall door and let him see if we can just encourage him to walk out on his own. And after about 3 weeks, we got so he would walk out of the stall. He would walk up the ramp upstairs, and all the horses upstairs would go sort of a little, well, nothing bad. I mean, we wouldn't have done it, right? But he used to clop his way up, and that was the beginning of him sort of returning a little bit to being, and it was all due to Georgette. She loved the horse. I didn't say she loved the horse, but she believed in the horse, and she knew that all the different things. And so that was the horse I took to Badminton, met Lars Cederholm over there, where David O'Connor was, went a little bit later with Wilton Fair. That was a really other interesting story. And Lars made me ride, I think we did 6 horse trials before Badminton, and we would walk the course. We would figure out, where the water was, right? I would double handful either before or after, and ride the one jump, which was the water jump, like it was the end of the world. And then I'd double handful again and sort of get him to where he realized that, jumping into the water, jumping, combinations through the water, and then we went to Badminton, and we were 10th at Badminton, and then came back and then did the Pan American Games, and then the Olympic Games, and it turned out. And then when he was finished, he was given to Jack, who then became, the coach of the team after the '68, game. So it was due to my current great wife's feelings and connection to the horse. And when I was 40th out of 47 horses after dressage in Mexico, and it was really interesting how that all worked out. We were down in Mexico, and Georgette was there doing the horse, and and I'd always go on with Grasshopper. He's the third or fourth. Mike was usually fourth. I was third. And one of the grooms said, Michael, hey, we heard Mike and Kevin talking. I heard Mike and Kevin talking in the store.
This is Kevin Freeman.
Yeah, Kevin. And Mike had Plain Sailing, one of the great horses of the world ever. Kevin had Chelan, who was world champion with Carlos Moratorio before. So, I mean, this wasn't anything, that you couldn't, justifiably say. I had Foster, who had quit out with I was third at the Pan Am Games in Winnipeg, but they had 2, world-class horses. And they said, they were talking to Lynch, and they convinced him that, I said, no way, I always go, third or fourth, right? I'm not going to go second. And Lynch came to me the next day and said, Michael, I've decided that you need to go second. So I jumped up and down a little bit, and nothing I could do, right? So I went second. And, the boys went third and fourth, probably justifiably so. Not saying there's anything, other than I was sort of irritated and pissed off about it. And, but I was 40th, and so what happened was, I went second, right? And, son of a gun, the monsoons start, right, around 1 o'clock. So, a little interesting story. I wouldn't have gotten around the cross country if it hadn't been. When I was back at Gladstone, Bert Denemesy, Count Denemesy or whatever, I used to commute to the city, 3 hours each way, 6 hours commuting, not every single day, but maybe 3 days a week, and then So one day I'm walking into the front door at Gladstone, and Bert's coming out, and I was getting tired of having to get up. If Georgette had the horse ready for me at 4:30 in the morning, right? I'd clump down the stairs, I'd get on, I'd ride out, in the dark, and get like an 8 o'clock train, so 7:30, so I'd be in to the to Washington Square and at work, and then get back on the train, come back in. One day, Bert's coming out. I said, Mr. Dennedy, can I talk to you? He sort of looked down his nose at me like he always did, right? And I said, there's something, not very democratic about the system of having the event riders always ride after the jumping riders. I said, I have to go to the city every day, and it just seems like it would be fair, somewhat to have the jumping riders change the schedule with the event riders. And Von Vichy was a friend and of Denemity. So whatever Denemity said, it was like, just law, right? And so he wouldn't even entertain any thought. So I knew I had to go right to Denemity, right? He sort of thought I was a creep. But, so he just sort of looked down his nose at me like I was, a peasant, which probably he thought I was, commoner, whatever. And I said, but in addition, we're the only ones that won a medal in Tokyo. So you jumpers didn't ever win a medal, right? So I think we should get some benefit of us winning the only medal. That did not sit well with him at all, right? So we never spoke again. Never. I knew he was pissed at me, and, maybe rightly so, but, there was a lot for me personally at stake, and that had nothing to do with the team. So we're in Mexico, right, at the Olympic Games, and I go second, and it's about a mile walk up to the start of the cross country. And I think it was Dr. O'Day and myself, go to, where the entrance to whatever, where the stabling and everything, which is separate, right? And as I'm going there, Georgette leads Foster up, and I have the saddle, and because I carry lead, right? And I have the saddle, and I think it was Dr. and I'm not sure what that was, right? I don't know whether it was Marty or Dr. O'Day or whoever. I don't think it was Marty Simonson. But, he hits it. We're standing there. I have the saddle, and Georgette's off with Foster. And we're standing out in the front where the cars come up. And he hits his head, and he says, "Oh, my God, Michael." I said, "I left my keys to our car back at the chalet." And just at that minute, about 100 feet away, is the show jumping team car with Bert, Billy, George, I don't know who else was in the car, Frank, right, park, right facing us. And I said, geez, look, good news, right? There's the show jumping car. Go over and, get the keys from Bert, right? And we'll use their car just to go up, and you can bring it back, right? There. So he walks over to Bert, and I promise you, I can see Bert shaking his head no, right? Not going to give the keys for me to go up to the start of the cross country, right? And just at that minute, right, a big that big Citroën pulls up, and in it is Guillaume, right, who I know from Saumur, and this really cute French girl sitting in the back, right? And so he's still talking to Bert. Bert, I know, is not going to let me take the car, right? Which, I can sort of understand. But, the Guillaume's right there. In no time, right? So I asked do you mind giving me? Oh, no, Michael, jump in, right? Go. So, because he went right before me or right after me. So I jump in the car and go up, we start the cross country, right? We go around, we go, do the steeplechase, everything's sort of going good, right? Foster, still Foster, real talented, looks like, I've always said he looks like Mike Tyson. If you get into him, there's a little heart, right? And so we get through and what I did was I went to the ground jury, and the small German spurs, the little pointed spurs that the German spurs, I went to the ground jury and asked if I could ride with those spurs, and they said yes. So obviously I needed a little bit of, enthusiasm for the horse if in case he was thinking about doing something he shouldn't have thought about. So we go, it's like the fifth or sixth is the water, they jump into the rushing stream, because there was a stream all the way across, right? And there we get, and as we're going, I think it was like 10 or 12, and way over to the left of the stables, and we're going, 40th, right? You only got one way to go. You put the pedal to the metal, and whatever happens, happens. So you go, and there was a jump, it was a bank with a big ditch, and then a railroad tie behind it, which was like 6 inches thick. I mean, it was like you had to go up on the bank, and then jump. It's like bounce off the bank over the railroad, crossing, right? So it was a big. And as we're going like bat out of hell to this thing, I could see his ears start flicking like he's looking at the stables, and I didn't know what he's saying. Hey, what the hell are we doing out here, right? There's the stables over there, and there looks like a big damn jump in front of me, right? Even though I'm going this fast, right? I think there's a way for me maybe to get out, and I'm going, oh God, yeah, right. This is it. So as we're going, he goes on, and I knew his heart was not in jumping it. The talent was there, but the heart was, right? So as we're doing in the air onto the bank with the ditch, with the railroad crossing in front of me, I think about Bert Timothy, and I go, Jesus Christ, right? Bert is going to be the happiest person in Mexico if I screw up and have a stop, or worse, get eliminated at this jump. I said, it's better to die than it is to have an refusal or an elimination. So I took those spurs and I stuck them in as hard as, the two spurs met in the middle of the horse. And he just launched, and he hit it between his chest and above his knee, and I could feel his rear, the tail coming up over me, and I was looking straight down at the ground, right? And I don't know what happened. Both his front shoes came off, right? And as I'm looking so straight down at the ground, right? But I'm saying, look, death is better than a refusal, right? I'm looking straight at the ground. I see one leg stick out in front of him, right? He hits the ground, doesn't flip over, right? Doesn't fall, right? His chest is, I don't know how, I think the momentum just pushed him through. He hits the ground, we go on, and we jump around clean. And, then the show jumping, I was fifth. I was fourth in Tokyo, which is a bad place to be, just missing medal. And then, what happened was the rains came. And when the rains came, the water that we were jumping is an open water ditches. It was about 6 inches above the edge. So 2 or 3 of the horses that were going in the rain, and Kevin rode, you couldn't see the horse's ears. It was raining so hard. So he had a problem, and Mike had a little problem. And so I was walking in the, shed row. The sun was shining when I was finished. And if I had gone in the rain, it would have been, I don't even want to think about it. And anyway, we got to the show jumping, and I was fifth after going around because of the eliminations, because of the rain, not because I was anywhere too spectacular, but, good enough. That's the way it is, right? And fifth. So, I think I jumped clean or something. and they were going the reverse order, and then Jimmy was, I think, third after and he's coming around. I'm standing there watching, and he comes around the corner, and the horse on the flat falls, slips, feet go out from underneath him, right, falls. Jesus, right? Now I'm fourth. There's one more horse to go, right? And it's Pavel Div who was leading for the gold medal and for the Russian team, and he's like 3 fences from the end, so I'm fourth, which is a shitty place to be because, I was fourth in Tokyo, right? So, it's, as long as you're there, you want to do good, obviously, right? So, he did 3 more jumps to go. I'm in fourth place, and instead of jumping the last 2 jumps, the last line, he turns, crosses the diagonal, jumps the wrong jump, right, and is eliminated. So then I'm third. So I get a medal. And what happened was, that Prince Philip was the FEI, whatever, and head of the whatever. And what happened was that the Russians got caught using walkie-talkies on the cross-country. And instead of creating an international incident, they eliminated the team by doing that. And so they went from gold medalist to nothing. And I moved up. And so when I was on the airplane going home, I went, Jesus Christmas, right? This has been a really good run, right? But it doesn't get any luckier than that. Doesn't get any better than that. Now's the time to just keep riding. And so that's when I made the transition to, do teaching, jumping, right? And
well, of all the medals that you won, Mike, and
right.
all your accomplishments,
Right.
which of those are you most proud of now when you reflect on your career?
Oh, yeah, but the one special medal is the picture we have in our family room. It shows me standing on the individual medal at Mexico, but Georgette's standing behind me with her pigtails holding the horse. And that to me is always the most special.
The family moment, absolutely. Special occasion. Well,
yeah,
from all your team activities, of course, for the US and the role that you played here, you then went on to become the national coach for Canada, didn't you, for the 76 Olympics and chef d'équipe for the 88 in Seoul and 90 World Championships and Barcelona as well. How did that come about? Because you mentioned Sheila Wilcox earlier, of course, in the days of Eddie Goldman. Sheila was, of course, the coach for the Canadian team in 75, just before you. 74, 75.
Yeah.
So how did your position come about, Mike? And did you see this as an opportunity to become a coach as a natural progression in your career?
No, not really. It was like everything else. It was just sort of a interesting aspect of education and experience. It's always nice to go to the Olympics, right? It's always nice to sort of do it. And, with Jimmy Day and Robin Hahn and, Kathy Wedge and
Liz Ashton
and Liz, right? Yes. So there was a really good team. Canadians are very independent people, right? I don't mean that in a negative sense, but I think with Sheila, it just didn't work. The dynamics didn't work. The riders rebelled. But the American riders rebelled with Jack, right? So, that's not anything unusual. And even today, when George writes about why they didn't do better in the Super League and the World Championships, it's the riders and the owners are interested in the Grand Prix on Sunday. Well, maybe the focus wasn't on the Nations Cup on Saturday, right? So that's an inherent part of individuals getting together as a team. And I think, when push came to shove, I think the team that went to the Pan American Games just now, was, when everything was at stake, the whole country, the whole thing for London. I think they came together, and for once, the real focus was on putting every piece of energy and knowledge and togetherness, and that's what happened. With the Pan American Games, and then qualifying and being 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 or whatever it was. I mean, there are great riders, but when team sports, when team scores, and George was the one that wrote it. Not me saying it, but the Pan American Games shows what the team is the sum of the parts, and when the sum of the parts all work in the same direction, you get a much better result. And if, perhaps, people have different priorities. I mean, not that Nations Cup isn't important. So, it's something that hasn't changed. It's like, the issue with Jack LeGoff. I think Jack was an enormously influential, positive, great horseman. But, the riders that grew up and had their own thoughts, Mike's and Bruce's, and ultimately had their own thoughts, right? And I remember when I took the team to, I was the one that Jack Fritz called me after Jack LeGoff was finished, and it was amazing. I mean, there I had some influence in Jack coming to the United States for the 12 years that he was here, and Jack Fritz called me about becoming chef de keep when Jack was, no longer, coach, and I remember going to Gawler, the World Championships, and I had the gold medal team from Los Angeles, and Kim Wellness, the Grey Goose, and Derek DeGrazia, and the medal team, Torrance and Karen and Bruce and Mike, and we went to Ranella, which was the big horse trials 2 weeks before the World Championships, and it was a really tough course, much tougher than the World Championship course turned out to be. And Jack LeGoff had called me on the phone and said, Michael, I'm taking a tour to, this is sort of the same idea of what George went through this summer. I'm taking a tour to Gawler, to World Championships, and I would be honored to be in charge of the spy system for the cross country. And I said, Jack, that was, that would be terrific. I would be honored to have you be in charge of that. I mean, no one knows more about what's cross country than, and being a coach. I'm not really a coach. I'm sort of, a chef de keep. And so, we, after Ranella, I think we were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and Mike had a fall and either dislocated his shoulder or something like that. And they were awesome. They were great. I mean, they were on top of the world. I mean, the course was really challenging, really tough. The horses were ready. And then I think probably 2 days later, Bruce and Mike came to me and he said, we'd like to talk to you. I said, sure. What do you want to talk to me about? He said, we heard that Jack LeGoff has offered to be head of the spy system. I said, yeah, isn't that great? I mean, who knows more about things? Well, we don't think that he's going to give us the right information. I said, you got out of your mind, right? He made you. How could he give you that right? And they said, no. They said, we're serious. I said, okay, well, I want everybody to get, so I had to set the 7 riders down around a big table, right? And I said, I'm going to go around the table, and I'm going to ask each and every one of you. I said, you have to tell me. I said, do you think that Jack LeGoff is going to give you the wrong information about the cross country? I had 7 riders. 7 riders all said yes. So I had to call Jack. tell him that couldn't have him doing the thing. So and then the event was a disaster. Everybody rode to it because they all thought they were capable, because of what they had done. They all and everybody screwed up. I mean, it was not good. But, it just shows to go you, right? I mean, if Jack had been there and they were all being pissing mad and did what he said, they probably all would have won again. But
that, of course, was the 1986 Gawler World Championships in Australia you're referring to. Let's look back then, Michael. You mentioned some really top names that have influenced your career that you've been involved with, starting with Eddie Goldman back there.
Right.
Who would you say were the most influential in terms of the influence they've had on you as a rider and as a clinician and coach?
Well,
in all of those roles, who would stand out for you?
Well, I think, from my time in France, right, Colonel Margot, as dressage, right, and Le Goff, right, and then Lars Sederholm, who I took Foster to, to England when we were, after I got him as a first ride. No one trusted him. So I said, well, we have to go prove it, in the world stage. So I went over because Lars had been, Meg Plum had trained with Lars in England. So she was very happy. I paid half, and she paid half, and I went and spent the winter and then rode at badminton. So Lars, who, Yogi Bresner, who's now the coach of the British team, right, spent 13 years with Lars, and Lars, always his mantra was in balance forward, and I still talk to Lars every Christmas, and I've gone and visited him in Sweden, and I think he, as an event trainer, certainly had the biggest influence as far as my competitive successes, right? And when I was in Germany at Paul Steckens, there was a Rainer. I was 20, and Rainer Klimke was 21, and Rainer Klimke, who became Dr. Klimke, and double Olympic gold medalist and double world champion and one of the greatest dressage warriors ever, was an event rider and already on the German national team going to Rome. And Rainer and I were not close friends, but I certainly respected his more knowledge and experience. He was already on the German national 3-day event team. And I remember talking to Rainer one day, and he had a tremendous influence on my philosophy and theory about riding. And I was talking to Rainer, and I said, Rainer, you have to be very proud, right? And I did my first 3-day event with Rainer in Germany on a mare called Amzitat, which was Paul Steckens' horse. And I said to Rainer, it isn't exciting yet. You're going to be on the German team, and, there's an outside shot that, maybe in 2 years, I'll see you in Rome. And Rainer looked me straight in the eye, and I'll never forget this. He looked me straight in the eye. He said, Michael, all event riders are crazy. And my mouth dropped open. Right. Now, this was Rainer Klimke at 21, and I was 20. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, you're a rider. He said, Michael, let me explain something to you. He said, I have read all the classic history of the theory of riding, and I have, and respect, the masters who have come before me. And I spent, part of every day of my life reading and trying to understand the theory of riding. And the one thing that I can be sure about is that the broader the foundation of going forward and straight, right, and the experience that I can establish with my riding skills, right, that ultimately the broader and sounder the foundation of my riding forward and straight, ultimately when I get to the very pinnacle of where I aspire, this is Kumka at 21, when I get to the pinnacle of where I aspire to go, because the foundation of where I've come from is broader and sounder, that I will ultimately be able to stay up there, go higher, and stay up there longer. This is 21.
Absolutely. I mean, there's talk about name dropping. There's a really eclectic group of horsemen that have influenced you. And now today, you, as you said, you continue to teach regularly and give clinics, Michael. So what is a typical day in the life of Michael Page now?
Right now, I get up at 5:45 every morning, right? And, at 6:45, I leave, and I'm up at the barn usually at 8 o'clock. And, I have a horse now at Kent. The reason I've been at Kent for 18 years, we have great donations. About 10 years ago, Robin Squealy at Acorn Hill Farm had a horse that she had won the World Cup class at Devon and the Upperville Grand Prix, a horse called Showman. And she sold it begrudgingly to Cornelia Guest, who was wanting to do the Grand Prix. And it didn't go too well because he was a very tough horse to jump the water. He didn't like jumping water. And but Tim Grubb, who was her trainer, said, Michael, this horse, and Tim Grubb has been in 4 Olympic Games. He said, Michael, this horse can jump the biggest oxer of any horse I've ever sat on in my life. And I went, holy shit. And that should be pretty good for me. And I rode him for 4 years without stirrups and did all my showing. So I remember down in Ocala, jumped level 7. I don't know what that is, meter 35, something like that. And I did all my showing without stirrups, right? Because I was never interested in competing. I just wanted to ride. And this horse was really cool. I mean, he could jump anything, right? But he didn't like the water. I mean, that was always a struggle. But so I did up to level 7 and no stirrups. And I used to jump on my horse, jump off my horse. And I remember going to a level 7 class, and Ian Miller was standing there. He said, you're not going to go in there without stirrups, are you? And I said, yeah, that's all I do. I still ride without stirrups. If you never put your stirrups on, it's really pretty simple to ride without stirrups. Anyone could do it. You can't be competitive, but you can enjoy the idea of riding your horse better because you sit tighter and your leg is better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I jumped around level 7 that. So, I think also, you ever heard of Benny O'Mara?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I have a story about Benny O'Mara, right? I was going down to judge, I don't know, it was Upperville, but Colony Farms is right on the main road when you go down to, I've forgotten what the town is, right? But everybody knows it. And Benny had just built Colony Farm, and it was unique and special. And Benny was a genius on horses, but came from he was a Bronx blacksmith or whatever he was, and started I don't know, he just kept it simple, right? He put a leg on each side and made sure that the horses went forward, and I think he rode with them. I don't know exactly, right? But I was I did not know Benny very well, but I certainly had heard the legend of Benny O'Mara, and and Benny knew who I was. I mean, we weren't friends. I wasn't, doing the same thing he did. He's, remember he sold Jacks Are Better to Neil Shapiro, was the first $25,000 horse, right? And he was, he revolutionized horse sales and jumping, and with Kathy, and But anyway, I stopped one day at just the one time that I was there, Colony Farms. I walked in, and Benny was in the indoor ring, and I've forgotten the name of the boy that was riding for him. And they had just started this horse, and the horse was a 4-year-old, and he gave the boy the leg up. And the thing, how they crow hop around when they're not used to saddles, when they're not used to anything, right? He sort of trotted around. Benny was standing on the start, and he sort of rubs under his chin, and he sort of, tells him, just let him sort of relax, go around. And, he said, I'm going to, give this horse a little school and see what he's like. And I said, geez, doesn't look like he's done much. He said, no, this is like the third time we've had him under saddle, right? And he looked it. I mean, it was like, holy geez, right? I mean, I wouldn't have wanted to be sat on him, right? So and then what was interesting was he had a little gymnastic. And the gymnastic was very similar to what Bert Timothy used to do, what I use, right? Is, the little balancing rail and the cross rail and a little oxer, and so the horse settled down, sort of trotted around, cantered around, and he was trotting, and then he said, okay, to steer him it was just there was a rail on the ground, put a rail on the ground, horse trotted back and forth on the rail, and then he said, geez, does that okay, right? And then he put a little balancing rail, a little cross rail, and there was standard set up for a little combination, right? And the horse trotted a little balancing rail and a little cross rail, and then he lengthened it and opened the distances up so the horse just quietly cantered to the little cross rail, and then it was a little oxer. And then he opened it up again, and then it was sort of like a cross rail, double cross rail. And he just come back and forth, and then he'd let him walk a little bit and pick up the canter, and you can see the horse prick up his ears. And they did this for like 20 minutes, and at the end of the 20 minutes, the horse was jumping like 4'9", right, through this little combination. I stood there with my mouth open, and Benny turns to me and said, I think I'm going to make some money on this one, right? And it turned out to be Steve's Poppet that Bucky Reynolds rode and won a couple of classes at the National Horse Show, right? But what was fascinating was to see how much he got into the horse's head and how he sort of adjusted every height and every distance to make this baby horse comfortable about, I've never seen it since or even dreamed about it, but it wasn't so much that it was unique and special of the horse, but it was unique and special of the trainer. And it was, it was just, but what was fascinating was how many different types of things he had seen, plus his genius about how he understood who the horse was and what the horse could do that made it, I don't, how, but I remember, 2 years later that, the Bucky, I think, told me, where the horse came from, what he was, how young he started, and it was fascinating to see that, right? It was, when you talk about, and also at Silmer, one of the great riders that I saw, Lars, was a working student for Major Henri Saint-Cyr. And Saint-Cyr, so there was Saint-Cyr and Margot and LeGoff and Sederholm and Pierre Durand, who became the Nez all that I got to ride with when I was at Silmer. So it was, but what was so fascinating was the theory was all the same, but the personalities of the people used the theory in different ways. I mean, only sense here, double Olympic gold medals had Jubilee or whatever the horse, and a couple of the other horses, and I used to watch him ride, and Lars used to warm the horses up and, do that. And then you'd see Margot, the theory was the same, but the execution of the theory was so different in the personality of the people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Michael, how would you like to be remembered as a horseman?
I just, that I've contributed something to a lot of the clinics that I've done, and, that the people, know more and ride better and have half the pleasure I've had in my life for helping understand how to make the horse go better because he likes you more, because you ride better. I think that would be the most satisfactory thing that one can do. And I'm 73 now, and I don't think anything's really changed. Each day is the same. I don't ride as well, as Billy said, but I probably never ride as well as I could have ridden. But, the pleasure and joy of riding, and I think for so many people, they don't necessarily become great riders, but they get an enormous pleasure from their riding and their connection to the horses.
Well, that's clearly something that you've done over the years, Michael, and led a very successful life as a competitor and a complete life as a horseman. And I want to thank you very much indeed for spending this time with us and sharing your reflections and memories on a life well spent with horses. Thank you so much indeed for your time.
And thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Please join me again next time when we celebrate the life of another equestrian legend.